So I want to welcome you. We're creating the Valley Stream Access of Good Transportation
Yes.
Planning. Thank you for being here, Stuart.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here. And as Chair Balducci mentioned, I was with Transform. I founded it 22 years ago, and I left last week. And so this is my first week as an independent consultant. So if you ask me for a business card, I just don't have one. So Transform worked at the local, regional, and state level. We did local demonstration projects, trying to, as well as regional and state policy, trying to knit together kind of smarter connections between transportation, land use, and housing, and also finding ways to have a more efficient transportation system so that we can see gains, not just for the people using it, but for social equity and for the environment. And we grew to have 31 staff and a lot of projects going on. And I just have to say that often lately, we're looking up here to King County to look for great examples, because Metro, as you may know, is basically one of 2 agencies in the entire country that is seeing their bus ridership grow. And there's a lot of great things happening here. And I'm going to be talking about how to get equity and new mobility. And one thing that's for sure is that you all are doing a lot on getting it in, our older mobility. So like the service guidelines that Metro has give a quarter of their ranking based on, embedding equity into it and trying to beef up those corridors. We're better at that. It's more predictable. There's certainty. We have control over that. But how do we get it into new mobility is really the question. The other question is, why do I have a bunch of kids walking and biking if I'm talking about new mobility here? And the reason I do is multifaceted, but this is actually the future. When we talk about mobility, ultimately, we need to have a very people-centered system where people, whether they're 10-year-olds, whether they're 80 and 90-year-olds, are able to get around, and being able to do that, in the modes like walking and biking. If you're planning for those, that you're going to have success with a lot of the other systems, because things like taking transit are going to depend on it. But also, we're finally seeing in these kids a turnaround because we've started to focus on their trips. My organization had run a program for Safe Routes to School for 20 years, and it worked both in some of the urban areas and in the very suburban areas where we also promoted carpooling. We saw a real shift, not just in how kids were able to get to school, but in freeing up parents' time to not have to drive their kids, which was about 25% of the trips. So why focus on equity? Well, one is that we've got a yawning inequality gap that is growing. And this, I just happened to grab this from the Seattle Times, but this is true of the entire region, where we've, including with the suburbanization of poverty, that the upper income folks are making more, and we have stagnation where the bottom 20% is earning just 2.6% of the income in 2016. And if that included wealth, it would be even more distorted. So inequality, continues to grow, and several studies, including a Harvard study from 3 years ago, found that out of all the factors they were able to look at, access to opportunities, physical access to opportunity by the transportation land use system was the most determinative on whether people can go out of poverty and get some upward mobility. And so the job that you have here in thinking about regional transit is going to be one of the most important for advancing opportunity and having kind of a more equal ability to thrive in our communities. Now, I said Metro is doing a great job, but the private sector is absolutely starting to disrupt transportation. There's all kinds of exciting and very positive opportunities being created by this. This is just some of the bike share and autonomous vehicles. I'll point out that the Afterbarty, that's our regional transit system in the San Francisco Bay Area, and you can see Lyft took their little pink lines and made it look like a bus system. But there's a lot of opportunity that can both be very positive. There's a lot of opportunity to complement transit and to get people around who might not have been able to, but also to compete with transit if it's not done right, and to add cars to the road. what's important, though, and that we'll get into, is that if all of this comes in without equity as a framework, it can actually increase the inequality that we have in our society. So we're going to talk about now what some of the challenges and obstacles are, the framework, and then some recommendations for how you might be able to get on top of this whole sector. So the first barrier is simply being able to access these services at all. And in terms of basic things, like having, many of them require a credit card. You go to an app, you put in your credit card, and for many of us, that's just, relatively easy to do. Some of you might even have a choice of cards. Which one do I want to use? Well, 17% of white households don't have access to a credit card, and 37% of black households. These are national figures from the Federal Reserve. And so you could already see, if we're talking about systems that are dependent on having access to credit, you're already going to be potentially increasing the kind of racial inequality that exists. And then there become a whole bunch of other barriers, things like language, the use of technology, and that's going to be, again, exacerbated with newer immigrants, with seniors, and then sometimes the citing for some of these that are site-specific. The other thing is that this is all coming at us really fast, and we generally don't have the governance, we don't have the planning system set up, we don't have the staffing, and we certainly don't have the experience, because it's all new, in being able to get in front of this. That means you need to set aside resources to really deal with this, and expect to kind of be doing a lot of learning about what's happening in the rest of the country, because you can't learn this if you send people to university. It's not in the textbooks yet. It's only at kind of the latest conference you might learn about what happened 2 weeks ago. I'm just learning about the VIA today by talking with Rob Gannon. So it's all happening very fast. We need new structures. There's insufficient data, and this is a big tug-of-war that you might have heard about, where these companies, incredibly cutthroat environment, you've seen Lyft and Uber losing $900 million and almost $2 billion respectively. Of course they don't want to release their data, but yet it can be so useful to help us plan our systems better, and to be able to see things like on equity, who's really using these systems. University of Washington and some other places are now creating third-party entities that might be able to hold and store the data, but that's going to be really useful for us to be able to understand if we're achieving outcomes, whether it's efficiency or getting towards climate outcomes, or with equity. And then finally is kind of living wage employment. And this is kind of one of these subtext battles, sometimes it comes to the fore, where, especially with Uber and Lyft, we're seeing folks who are contract workers without health benefits. Often when they're using their own car, they don't even really know how much they're making after depreciation. And how do we get on top of this so that we use all of this new mobility as an economic pathway, and kind of respect what we have in terms of existing labor, but yet be able to go ahead and make some of these experiments happen, like you just heard about with VIA. So these are just some of the challenges and obstacles that we face as we get into this kind of new world, where we don't just get to vertically integrated, plan and construct and operate and maintain what we have. And the final one is good old-fashioned discrimination. This is just, under the old guard at Uber, rate of cancellation when drivers would see or expect who their passenger was. And if you had a name that sounded black, you were 2.5 times, and you were male, 2.5 times as likely to get a cancellation from that driver as if you were white. And so we have to also, that's just not going to happen in the same way on the public sector roles. So Transform, several years ago, decided we had to try to get ahead of this and use some of our work to get some good demonstration projects on the ground. And we started with deep community engagement. That first picture showed kind of after some of the groups that we re-granted to lead bike rides, to kind of say what are the barriers that you're experiencing in your community, where are the places you'd like to get to, kind of have people mapping out their community, the destinations they really want to see. And then we had local demonstration projects, worked with some of the larger cities because the kind of smaller cities didn't have staff for it yet, on guidelines for these networks. And then out of our Sacramento office, we're doing state policy. And I'll just describe quickly 2 of the demonstration projects. So one was called Lift Up Oakland, launched about a month ago. And Lyft took over the bike share company that runs the Bay Area's bike share, Motivate, and wanted to do something good by expanding into East Oakland. But we had just had all of this deep community engagement there, and we said they don't just want bike share pods. There won't necessarily be strong use of them. The infrastructure is not good, and other reasons. And so taking the recommendations that we'd received, worked out kind of a 4-part program. One, where folks there really didn't just want 45 minutes on a bike. They said, well, sometimes I need it for a 5-hour trip. And so worked out having bike resource centers at public libraries. And there's going to be a program where local people of color-led bicycling groups are going to have training programs for youth in and coming out of high school, and be able to employ them to fix and maintain these bikes and lend them out as part of the library system. That's going to give people that get on bike share access to a bicycle kind of for a longer term. They're going to fill in very specific bike share gaps, but then they're also going to get in economic empowerment through biking, and that's going to be by creating these business districts where we have mobility hubs, so the bike share become a larger mobility hub, and have activities that happen them in front of local businesses, including kind of art engagement with culturally relevant kind of art that brings people to those businesses, and it happens to be at the mobility hub. So really trying to pair these things. And then finally, working with unsheltered and underserved youth that are at the greatest risk of displacement and homelessness, to have free or super discount transit passes, bike share and scooter share, and free Lyft rides, and things like that. The program is about $1 million investment from Lyft, and they're very excited. But again, it's ideas that came out of the community. Bike Share for All is another thing that people wanted. They were finding that as we went to expand Bike Share in 2016, only 3% of the memberships were low-income memberships, which were $5 for the first year and 5 months, $5 per month thereafter. And so we got together all of these local groups and said, let's create our own outreach and really go deep into the community to show the positive benefits of it. And they even did things like saying, hey, this very corporate logo that they have, especially with Ford Go Bike, is just turning our folks off, and came up with this graffiti-based logo, which really appealed to people. And after 2 years of engagement in the community, now fully 20% of memberships are low income, kind of matching that low income quintile category. And so we got this kind of experience and said, but these new modes are coming in kind of fast and furious. And we need to get ahead of this and kind of create a framework for growth. And so as scooters come in, as autonomous vehicles come in, we know the questions to be asking, the indicators to use. And so that's when we came up with this framework for equity outcomes. And it has 4 categories. They're in the PowerPoint. They're also kind of in slightly more detail in your attachment. The first one we focus on is access. And ultimately, this is kind of, in many ways, the most important one. It's kind of at the heart of transportation. And we have some questions that we ask new mobility as it comes in. And so these are some of the sample ones. First of all, does it provide a link to public transit? This is important because ultimately public transit needs to remain the backbone of our system. We don't have enough road space to have everybody in an autonomous vehicle with 1 or 2 or 3 other people. We're going to have to make public transit that backbone to have our overall transportation system continue to function as this region thrives and grows. Does it get to more key destinations? And while it's doing that, are we reducing travel time for folks and prioritizing the needs of marginalized communities? And so having these kind of experiments like you heard about today, getting in the Rainier District, is kind of doing that. And I have to say, I kind of gave this presentation earlier, and some of what I'm saying feels obvious here in this region because you're ahead of the curve, but you're one of the only places that is. And so, please excuse me if some of this feels like, but we're doing that. It's actually King County that we're taking some of these ideas from when I give this presentation. Affordability, is the price low enough? And I'll give you an example soon on that. Is the cost higher than any existing services that are being cut? Mostly, Metro is expanding here with kind of some recent funding, but in a lot of areas, there's a lot of cuts taking place and being replaced by new mobility. And can it reduce long-term costs? And this is a really important one to think about because ultimately the biggest cost folks have is to own and operate automobiles. And so if we're getting people great new services, including that get to their door, this might be a way to really reduce vehicle auto ownership. Finally, health. We have to have indicators for, are we reducing pollution? And the next presentation on the bus service is going to talk about how we might be able to do that in the most marginalized communities that have the biggest health issues. In King County, 60% people making under 35,000 have 60% higher asthma rates than folks making over 50,000. So there's going to be a lot of benefit in focusing things like pollution abatement on on these marginalized communities. Is it accessible? Does it reduce health disparities? Is another one. And finally, with income and equality, can we increase employment in some of the ways I discussed? Can we create whole new pathways of employment? All these firms are going to have jobs from fixing scooters to driving vans. How do we make sure these are living wage employments and training pathways for them? And these training pathways are going to be especially important because eventually automation is going to come. I think it seems like it's going to be slower than many of us thought, but it's going to come to certain sectors, and we need to do that. So anyway, this set of questions is a way to really make sure that we're kind of confronting all of the different goals that you might have as these new mobility things come in. And these can be paired with different indicators. A new report I had about road pricing and equity really tries to pair these kind of questions with very specific indicators. And it's a lot to go through. And you might say, wow, we have to consider this before every pilot project, before every decision. But there's a real transportation efficiency argument to be made to go through these. And if we want to keep our areas from getting too congested, if we want to keep our suburban areas, especially as some displacement happens, and these lower density areas don't have good service, if we want to make sure they're going to the people that are most needed, it's great to ask these questions. And if we don't, you might end up with some of the things that are happening in Los Angeles right now. So if you've been to Los Angeles over the last 5 years, you might have noticed congestion's actually getting much worse. And that's saying something about a place like Los Angeles. And so UCLA looked into this, and they say, why is our transit ridership declining even as we make massive investments in transit with $40 billion funding measures and they found that one of the three reasons, well, one was all these new mobility and people taking Lyft and Uber because the transit system is slowing up in traffic. And the other one is that the lowest income households are buying vehicles at a much higher rate than they used to and owning vehicles at a much higher rate. And part of this is that they're not giving priority to their bus system and the buses are slowing down. And it's becoming this cycle. And so the lower income folks are going to be the most price sensitive. And that means price in terms of both time and dollar cost. And if we're not making a system that works for them, you're going to see a growth in vehicle ownership that just creates terrible congestion. And if you do make a system that's great, you're going to see them saving money, getting more healthy through active lifestyles, and having better access and being able to get out of poverty. It really can be a tremendous win-win if you focus on equity. So now I'm just going to tell you two quick tales and then get to my final recommendation. And I was told in my last presentation, I'm going to get rid of the word blindside here. Frameworks that avoid the blind side as we strive for efficiency. Dublin, California, a low-density area that's growing outside, 20 miles outside of San Francisco, had 2 very poorly used bus lines, and it really made sense to get rid of them and find some other way, like with VIA, to get people to their destinations. And they did a pretty good job of coming up with a ride alternative with Uber, Lyft, and a taxi system. And they did things like having a call-in option. So for people without an app, they were able to call in. They made the 2 out of the 3 were wheelchair accessible. They had a cash payment option. So really a lot of the things that you might look for in an equity framework. But they did not think about price. And so a lot of people that are using this system now, a lot of the benefit, basically the cost of those bus lines went into this. So suddenly, a lot of people are getting 50% off, which is what you get, on use of your system, up to $5 worth, basically. And so for $3 or $4, you're getting around town, you're getting to the transit station, and maybe you're getting to the bus, where you have a bus pass to take you to your destination. But people that had that bus pass used to have an annual cost of $250 to $700, depending on if you were youth or senior or adult. And they now have that same cost for their bus pass, plus $1,800 to $2,500 per year to get to their bus. And there was no low-income discount built into this. And instead, many of these are going to, very upper class or middle class kind of subsidy. And so we need to walk through those kind of questions and have those kind of indicators so that you avoid those kind of mistakes, because we do want this kind of efficiency, but we want it done right. The other thing is that if you have no regulations on this, you can run into problems. Last year, this is a blog, Engadget blog, scooters invaded San Francisco. And they were lying all over. 1,000 complaints a week came into the city. They put a cease and desist order, took them all out, and said, we're going to put in some regs. They wanted to do equity right, and so they had a requirement for the 13 applicants. You have to have a low-income strategy that includes discounts and includes an outreach strategy. We thought, great, that was really good. But they didn't focus on outcomes. And so those original regs turned out that the results were in, and the results showed that there was only 1% of the members were low income. So they decided, we're going to, if they want to expand the program, because there's only 750 scooters, requiring them to hit milestones of actual subscribers. So they can get 175 more scooters for each of the 2 companies if they get 150 more low-income riders. And if they get 500 more low-income riders, they can get 450 new scooters. So this way, you're essentially building in the equity as these companies kind of can grow. So focusing on outcomes when it's possible is going to be the best way to approach this. And I'm going to end just very quickly with some recommendations, and these are also kind of in more detail in the report. But clearly, that authentic engagement needs to happen. We don't know what the community really needs. And authentic engagement takes resources, it takes time. Often we did re-grants to resource the groups that we were working with, so they didn't have to have their own staff or personal time going into it. And that way you can have ongoing engagement more easily. These demonstration projects are critical. All of this is new. Companies come in and out, but if we're okay with the idea of these demonstration projects, we're going to learn what works. And so even though public agencies don't always embrace that, it does seem like Metro and King County are doing that, and it's important. Giving the shared modes priority is really critical. In California, we've allowed clean air vehicles, electric vehicles, into our carpool lanes. It was a good thing, and we got more clean air vehicles purchased, which is good for our climate. At the same time, we now have more congestion in many of our carpool lanes than we have in the regular lanes, especially in areas like near Palo Alto or Marin. And we have buses with 50 people going 1 or 2 miles an hour, meaning the environment's actually getting worse, and our whole system is breaking down. So we must, as we do this, whether they're electric, whether they're autonomous, they've got to have more than one person in them if we're going to give them a priority to move quickly in lanes, or it won't work for our system. Equitable coverage, and then planning these into housing and land use. We can talk about how to do that. But with this new ability not to own cars, we can have less parking. That can reduce the cost of homes, make it so that we can have more homes at more affordability levels. As you'll hear about this in the next presentation in different ways, the increase in shared electric is going to have the biggest public health benefits in more marginalized communities. A plan for affordability, as my description of Dublin, California kind of described why we really need that. Being okay to use public funds to scale these equity projects is very controversial in some areas. A lot of unions, which we work with closely and support, are complaining as some of the bus lines are cut and money going towards these projects. And it's a negotiation and conversation about what is the future of mobility. And I do think there's a way for everybody to win, and especially if we're focusing a lot of these services, like with VIA, on supporting transit, so transit grows in the region, then everybody can be a winner. And as I had discussed before, creating economic pathways. And all of these are in a little bit more detail in the report. So again, it's a pleasure to be here. This county and this region are doing so much right. A lot of the country is looking to you, and I think if you can work with Metro to make them into the mobility company that they're looking to be, a mobility agency, it can really be a beacon that you do great things with. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a pretty high flyover. I appreciate it, but I'm hoping there will be some questions. Why don't we start with questions to make sure we've got understanding of what we're talking about here, and then maybe some discussion. Councilmember DeCoursey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple of comments quickly first. I'm a transplanted upstate New Yorker, so we have a little bit of an Empire State contingent here
You can
today.
join, yes. What city are you from?
Gloversville.
Gloversville.
Yes.
My folks have a place right outside of Northville.
Northville, there
Yeah,
you go. So we
next
all know
door,
where we're at. Secondly, I thought it was quite interesting. On one of your slides, there's a company called DeSoto Cab Company, and there's probably just a handful of people we can count in one hand in this room that remember the DeSoto vehicles, cars. So, question for you, Stuart. On the Lift Up Oakland, this seems to be really something that is geared mainly toward the major metropolitan areas. Do you see any type of a potential rollout or incorporation into the smaller areas like our communities and how something like this could work?
It's a great question. On that particular one, I really do. I mean, so it had the four elements that I described, and they could be done at different scales. So the one of finding the people, and especially the youth, most underserved, and we have unsheltered, but maybe that's not the case, and getting them this kind of full access to mobility, and trying to make it free. Is just an incredibly important goal, and can break down barriers and so that could be done through existing community groups. That can be done, by partnering and possibly with public funding. And so that doesn't need the private sector funding necessarily. That's where I'm talking about kind of doing these demonstration projects and scaling them. And I think a significant amount of funding should be put into affordability for those people who are really at the very lowest parts of the income scale or economic spectrum. Other ones like bike repair and bike lending libraries, I don't think need a city or town larger than 50 or 100,000 as long as there's a demand for cycling. And so if you don't have that demand yet, get that bicycle infrastructure going, get the culture going, and then a program like that can work. But that's going to employ a few people, but mostly get these kids trained in how to fix their own bicycles, and that in these areas where whoever has a bike here, you take your bike in to get repaired, and it's like, how did that become $145? To fix my brakes and get a new cassette, and so actually those kind of skills can keep kids self-sufficient, as they go forward. And then finally, the placemaking is with economic development. Any kind of downtown or commercial center, some of these businesses that are having a harder time are suddenly, as we're talking to them, excited about the idea that we could we could take a couple of parking spots in front of them and make a place that people will gather and have it be a place that is a mobility hub with bike sharing and car sharing and near a transit stop, but also then have programming and have some of that be outside. And so those kind of ideas all seem applicable.
Councilmember Higgins.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you also again for the presentation. Kind of related to Claude's question, in some of our communities, some of the suburbs of Seattle, we have a higher percentage of recent immigrants, languages, non-English speakers, and what I worry about is if things start to transition towards the Lyft, Uber type services and transit, fixed transit route dollars are pared back to accommodate that, but some of these communities aren't able to access the new services because of a language barrier, for example, or we all have smartphones, but not necessarily everyone knows how to use them in the same way with the same apps. What would you recommend for communities like that in some of the suburbs of Seattle?
Yeah, it's a super question. I guess there's a kind of a whole area of recommendations, and it's going to be very place specific. Part of it might be kind of a cultural acceptance. When we did the bike share outreach, part of the reason we went so intensively into the areas of East Oakland is that there had been a big rebellion in San Francisco against taking parking. And what we found was that by really being in the community, and again, having leaders of that community leading the outreach, so we did a lot of re-granting, the kind of understanding of the potential benefits of these modes and the acceptance went up dramatically. And so I think one of my recommendations would be to set aside enough outreach funds that aren't just for Metro staff and others to go out and do that outreach and engagement, both on what kind of services might they want to use in their destinations. But then once you've made the decision to move ahead and try a VIA or try a bike share or try whatever new systems are replacing the fixed route, that some of the outreach is actually led by those communities. And essentially what you end up having is a whole kind of outreach management team. Often some of these cities and the region would contract with Transform or other groups because they didn't know how to have 8 local bicycle shops leading this outreach or community groups. But knowing that amount of kind of depth and engagement so that it can get explained, you can have the funding for, I know there's at least 13 primary languages here, right? I know some of the translation here is now going into languages that and so expecting that budget essentially for that engagement, but through each part of that planning process is going to happen. The other thing is to seeing if we can have kind of things that merge the fixed route without having necessarily the full-size buses if they're not flexible. And so it could be kind of these shuttle routes and more shuttles to specific places and things like that kind of find that middle ground.
Councilmember Markson.
Thank you. So I was intrigued during the talk about Lift Up Oakland. I represent the City of Redmond Council, and just last night we adopted an ordinance and resolution to bring in bike and scooter share.
Hooray.
And finally, took a while, but one of the concerns that we talked about during our run up to this was we have local bike shops that also rent bicycles, and that
Yeah.
the question was, is this going to compete with them?
Yeah.
Their rental, and they're more of a half day, full day, multi-day type rental versus the 15-20 minute type rental that you see with the bike share. Did Lift Up Oakland run into anything along those lines, and if so, how did they deal with that?
Yeah, so they don't have rentals. So experience with bike share, we've studied bike share, and it has eaten into rental businesses in places like the Washington, D.C. region and San Francisco, and it might eat into in Redmond. What they found in D.C., the bike shops were very concerned that there'd be fewer bike purchases. But it was done at the same time, and then, of course, the repairs and everything that goes along with it. It was done at the same time that they were putting in a lot of new bike infrastructure, and there was a serious trajectory up in biking. But then they had a huge leap in bike usage as soon as they got bike share in. It's very well, Capital Bike Share is very well used. But then those users started realizing, wow, I have to go to it's not dockless, right, at first. So you had to go to these docks, and then you park it, and you have to walk still a quarter mile. And the bike shops saw a surge in business because all of these people realized, this is kind of crazy. I have to always go around and find these bike shares. Let me just get my own bike. And so they're thriving, and there are new bike shops opening, and the existing ones are having great business, but the rental businesses have been hit. So I would just recommend to some of them, if they can kind of transition or grow that part of other parts of those businesses.
Yeah, most of the bike shops do rental on the side, if you will.
Yeah,
They're
right.
Yeah, they sell.
Yeah.
Good to know. Thank you.
Councilmember Wright.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Stuart, thank you very much for your presentation. You have introduced a lot of very interesting concepts, food for thought, and I very much appreciate that.
Thank you.
One of the things I'm concerned about, and some of the aspects you mentioned were that for some folks that these services may eventually become free, and that they're, I mean, based on need and based on income and that sort of thing. And that caused me to wonder, at what point, I mean, assuming that a trip from point A to point B costs a fixed amount for the average person, no matter really what their circumstances, if you are shifting the cost so much to one side and while still distributing the benefit equally, at what point do you end up with an equity problem, just like the one that, we're eventually, initially trying to solve here?
Right.
And,
right.
Is there some self-regulation that actually takes hold, or at some point when those folks that are paying so much for the
Right.
same benefit that others are receiving for free just say, I'm not going to do this anymore?
It's certainly possible. It's a great question, and it's especially important because with the growing region, there's a probability that you'll be going even back to voters at different times and looking for more funding. So it's a great question. And I would say that no region I have studied has gone so deeply towards focusing on equity that they've run into that problem yet. And as I said, people look to King County for a focus on racial and social equity. So maybe you would be the first region to kind of start hitting that. What I would say, though, is that the cost, there's several costs. It's a little bit like our healthcare system, where people that were uninsured end up costing our healthcare system a tremendous amount, and that costs come back to people like me who now, without it as an independent, have to buy their own private insurance. And my insurance is higher because we don't have a system that insures everybody. Yeah. And they only go to the emergency room when their tumor has grown so large or whatever the issue has been.
Yeah, that's exactly my point. You get to a point where the overall cost becomes prohibitive for some
Right.
folks to
Right.
participate.
Right. And so I would say with transportation, two things. the largest cost that people have for transportation by far is their own private automobile. And when we did a study for the Bay Area, this was with 2010 census data, we found that all of the taxes and fees people paid were just 1/7 of what was paid by them to for their private transportation costs, either own and operate a vehicle or for public transit fares. And if we can, and then there's the cost of congestion, which is skyrocketing here, which takes all kinds of costs. If we're able to provide services for those most in need, it starts to have a variety of societal benefits. And I think those societal benefits have to be elucidated and quantified so that if people are understanding them, they might be okay with the cost. Getting back to healthcare, I'd be okay with paying more to get everybody insured, because if they can then do preventive insurance, it actually may bring down my rates in the long run. And so if we can provide both great and reliable and inexpensive service for the lowest income folks, it's going to mean we keep that very low car ownership amongst people who are most price sensitive. It's going to mean those people have the best chance of getting out of poverty and being able to participate in the economy of this region, helping this economy thrive. So people, if ever we get into that next recession, the King County region, can be resilient by having, workers at all levels and businesses that have at any time a better store of workers. We are reaching the point in a lot of these metropolitan regions, and especially the cities that do end up being the economic engine with a lot of people commuting in, living in, in our areas and commuting in, where business is going away because of the commutes. We just lost North Face from our region a couple of weeks ago. They're going to go to Austin. And they couldn't find workers to work in the East Bay because they couldn't afford it anymore. So this is, if we can break the cycle of poverty by doing this with transportation, if we can get people to reduce their vehicle ownership, we're going to create a functioning transportation system that gets the whole region to thrive and be an area that can continue to have that kind of distributed economic growth. And so I think there's a lot of reasons why having public funds go towards these equity demonstration projects, go towards these affordability, can have these benefits. And that other report I mentioned about kind of pricing and equity has a lot of these indicators that you can use and you can set up to measure before and after to show what these kind of, say, financial savings are by having these programs overall.
Yeah, I agree completely. I thank you very much for that. I think that you have to constantly sort of reevaluate and make sure you hit that point where the system is sort of self-adjusting so that it becomes the rising tide that lifts all boats.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Councilmember Updegrove.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a great discussion, and I wanted to pick your brain on one other item. King County offers a discounted bus fare and income-based option for a Orca Lift Pass. Another thing we do is provide some free bus tickets to human service providers. But in our budget this last year, we made a significant financial commitment to developing a free or very low income-based fare, and the agency's doing the development work. And I'm wondering if you have any kind of practical suggestions around how to administer that, things like income eligibility, outreach, that's success, how to connect with folks. Have you seen it in other parts of the country and through your informal work, or any words of wisdom as we embark on that this year to finish developing and implementing?
It's a great question, and we have run into that a little bit. And have to say, I just heard about that program today that you're developing, and I think it's fabulous, and it's really not happening in other areas. So thank you for doing that. The eligibility program, it's turning out to be in places like New York that are doing a Fair Fares program now. They're finding that the whole administration is just slowing the program up dramatically. And we found that when we were doing the Bike Share for All outreach, we got them to approve 4 different types of eligibilities, being on, our electrical, has a low-income discount. So if you have any of those 4, you're good. But we found as we were doing our outreach, people didn't carry around those cards with them. People didn't have the bills. Often we were trying to get to youth. And we actually started allowing and motivate the company that administered it, allowed us to take people's word for it. So if we were at this, community organization designed for underserved youth, and we were talking to an 18-year-old in high school who said, yes, my family is on low income. Yeah, I think we're on food stamps, we're on all those things. We didn't make them get the documentation. And kind of a false positive, not such a problem, right? So somebody whose income happens to be $37,000 finds their way into one of these low-income programs when 35 is the threshold. It's not going to bring the whole system to a ground. But if you can get another 100 people into it because you created a system of trust, and even if you have 3 false positives, so that's one way to do it, is like, how can you just know that in certain circumstances, you don't need that substantiation? Yeah.
I'll dive in here. I have a couple questions. So first is just a kind of more of an understanding question. In the framework itself, when you look at the income column, you talked about create new pathways, and here it says create economic pathways. Talk a little bit more about that, if you would. Just sort of, is that from a standpoint of the people who are providing the service only, or is it also an economic development sort of communities kind of approach?
Yeah.
How does that look in reality?
So yeah, so I think you can kind of think of it in 3 ways, as kind of private sector encouraging them or giving incentives to kind of do the right thing by creating pathways, training, and all. The middle ground is to do it through regulation of the private sector as they grow. Mm-hmm. And then the other way is just thinking about within your own metro and other public sector components, how you're kind of doing that kind of training for what are becoming the new jobs. It says one example in my picture up there where I showed the 6 new mobility providers. You saw Scoot, which has these red scooters. Mm-hmm. And they've made a commitment to trying to have kind of living wage job with health benefits for people that repair their scooters, and they're doing training. They're going out into putting their repair facilities in the Bayview, in the lowest income communities, and then having a training program. It's not incredibly complicated because they only have one product to learn how to repair brakes on a scooter and other things. And they're doing that hiring and training from within that community. Mm-hmm. And so they're getting people who are local, who don't have a commute, who didn't have a job. Often they're working with organizations that were kind of post-incarceration, working to try to get people into pathways. And so that's just one example of how they actually wrote on their application that was going to be one of the things they did. When I said the city had a cease and desist order and put out these regulations, if you want to take a look at what are really onerous regulations, wow, to get 750 scooters out, they had 80 to 100-page applications. It was insane. I was like, well, I think they went too far. We encouraged them to have a lot of regulations, but I was like, wow. So anyway, these companies were stepping over each other to be impressive. And that was one of the things that they put forward, and it's one of the reasons they got chosen, was this economic pathway.
right.
But it wasn't a regulation, it was kind of an incentive that they did it, but you can make it a regulation, and of course, within the public sector, they can do very similar things.
Right. Yeah, and the second thought I had out of three was it does seem that there's an interface between the public sector and the private sector in all of this. I mean, if you look outside now, the vast majority of vehicles moving around are sold by the private sector, owned privately, and operated privately, like my own car, right? Yeah. But we've had some harsh lessons. I mean, we, in one of our flexible shuttle programs, the operator folded up tents virtually overnight and disappeared. We had 3 bike share companies initially here in Seattle, and now there's 2, and one of them wasn't one of the original 3. And so it's like, there's a reason, I think, why the public sector is the correct mode for lifeline service, because we start up slow, and some of my tech friends complain about our cycle times in the startup phase, but we don't disappear overnight either. We're going to be there. So do you find that there's a way to make sure if we start to build multiple vectors of mobility in this way, that we minimize the risk of modes just disappearing overnight, especially if people come to rely on them?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't know how long your VIA program, that you just launched, is that a 2-year program or something? Is that
Rob's signaling one year.
Yeah. So it's a real issue. These companies are coming and going, and as we learned because of the Lyft, Uber, IBOs, they are bleeding money. Enough so, I mean, Chariot closed down. I think that's who you're probably referring to. And I mean, that's a company owned by Ford, and
Right.
Ford had staked their future part on it, and they couldn't make it. And Lyft and Uber losing 800 million, 2 billion respectively, almost
Yeah.
2 billion. And so it's a tremendous issue. And so I think what it means is the funding commitment to these demonstration projects has to be at a scale that we might not be used to for things that are unproven. And the willingness to fail, the willingness to get complaints, the willingness for people to, say to Metro, why are you doing it in this community but not the other? Because that's the nature of demonstration projects, has to be much higher than the public sector, tolerance usually is. But it's the only way we're going to be able to keep up with the new mobility is by being frank with the public about that. And if you have a larger, commitment of funds, and this might have to come if there's a new funding measure, right? Because probably a lot of the existing funds are spoken for, and then you'll be able to kind of have this not be a 1-year demonstration project, but at least be resourced kind of for a longer period, those kind of things.
I'm feeling that comment about the tolerance, because I had a really nice email from a constituent who wasn't upset about the fact that we were providing but about where the lines were drawn. Like, why were the boundaries of this pilot project not 3 more blocks this way, because that's where I live? And it ended with, "You're asleep at the switch, council member." And I'm like, I'm not, though. I'm really not asleep at the switch. It's just I can't go everywhere. So anyway, Councilmember Up the Grove.
Right.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Her question spurred another one with that, some of the trade-offs with public versus private delivery, and some of, as we get creative with alternative service delivery and modes, to be more nimble and keep up with technologies. One of the benefits, what I see as a societal benefit of some of the publicly provided services, is we often have good-paying union jobs with benefits. Whereas when we get creative and more nimble with other partners, we may have service being provided by providers that don't provide the same level of economic opportunity for those who are working in it. And I think of sometimes we'll have community shuttles to connect through third-party providers, and you could have amalgamated transit union drivers of buses doing that for wages, but often we'll contract out with a community provider who may pay minimum wage to a driver, that kind of thing. And then it can be a real economic trade-off within a community for that. So how have you seen labor relations play out? How do you, just like you talked about economic pathways for the businesses themselves with bike share, are there ways to build in economic opportunities and or ways to ensure we're not moving backwards on some of these other broader economic goals while meeting our employment.
Yeah.
How have you seen that tension play out, and
Yeah.
any advice?
Yeah, I've seen the tension play out very personally. So after we announced Lift Up Oakland, some of ATU, some of the transit unions were flipped out on us for participating with Lyft at all because they just see them as a competitor and as a competitor that's not paying living wages, et cetera. So I've been dealing with that firsthand for about the last 5 months, that issue. You know, and it's a real hard question because we want some of these smaller services to get, especially into the lower density areas, harder to serve areas. You have to have these smaller vehicles, whether it's an individual car or a van like the Vias or a shuttle. And we can't really, if we're going to be honest with ourselves, have those driven by union drivers because the whole process wouldn't, you're not carrying enough riders to make it worth it. And yet those kinds of vehicles are going to be the best for this on-demand service very often. And so I do think that the middle ground is having either a requirement, if you're going to be putting public funding for it, that there's some definition of a living wage put forward for any project that's going to be getting public benefits, even if it's not unionized. And, you know, we won't get into how to define that here, but that I think is going to be one of the most important and responsible things. And the other thing to do is, now the whole regulation of these things is really crazy because, you know, very often it's up to the cities to regulate, and there's not, you know, King County is probably not responsible for what happens in Bellevue with a scooter share, kind of. It's, but you might want to look to have some way, and maybe it's this committee that can even think this through, you know, with Metro, of how do we have common expectations, regulations, incentives amongst our cities so that when an operator is coming in, they know that if their folks that pick up the bikes, that drive the cars, are going to be having this living wage if they want a permit to get into our city. And maybe it messes with their business models a little bit. Maybe it means you'll have a few other entrants into the field. But the truth is, if the only way this works is that people are making kind of less than minimum wage or minimum wage, it's not going to, it just ends up leading to this constant cycle that we're having of displacement and people not being able to afford this region. So that would be one of my recommendations.
Yeah. All right. I think we could do this probably all day. It's so fascinating, such a fascinating discussion. And we do have one more business item. I wanted to ask one last question. It's a big one, and we may not have time to actually really delve into it appropriately, but I want to lay it on the table for future thought, perhaps. I look around this room, this committee, other rooms I sit in to talk about these issues, and we're talking about engaging communities of color and marginalized communities, and that's not who's sitting here by and large. And so I think we really need to think carefully about how do we go about doing that? How do we go about engaging? We're the ones who are here to do this work, and that's okay because, you know, sort of it needs to be done by people who care and who are thoughtful and who are here. But you said something before about helping the community to lead the discussions and maybe even plan some pilots. And I just think the sort of the how of that is something we may not have a lot of experience with yet here.
Yeah, and the how is so very important. Somebody at my lunchtime presentation when I did this asked, you know, how to do that engagement, and the making sure that the community is really involved and helping to shape it from the very beginning, and with this stuff all the way throughout implementation is incredibly important. And so I said, for example, when we go ahead and do surveys in the community of what those community needs are, you saw those people filling out those maps, those surveys are done in participation with the community groups so that we're not developing the surveys and saying, can you distribute these to your folks? And then she said, oh, that's funny because I'm here to distribute a survey and I developed it myself and I wanted equity responses. So knowing that the communities don't have, and these groups that you might want to work with as intermediaries don't have the resources to participate and really need to be resourced to do this on an ongoing basis, and probably more money than you have currently set aside to help with those kind of liaison organizations, and that you could have steady staffing at those places so they become familiar with these issues, become familiar with your staff, I think is going to be a really critical part of this.
Thank you so much. I mean, just a lot of food for thought here. It's actually, some of this discussion is very validating because Metro really is on top of a lot of these things. I mean, when you talked about the willingness to go out and try new things and take that risk that the public sector normally doesn't. We've had the Community Connections program for quite some time here now that's been trying different things in many different places. Sometimes they go on, sometimes they don't. But so I feel encouraged to continue.
Excellent.
Thank you so much, Stuart, for coming to see us and for speaking to us today. And we'll probably be in touch with more questions. I hope that's okay now that you're on your own and not getting a salary. All right. Thank you.
Thank you all. You're doing great.
Thanks so much. Just as a way of wrapping up this part of the conversation, I want to say one more time that all of this good discussion we've been having over the last few months is in service of working towards our mobility framework that is coming to us in the fall. The motion that set up the mobility framework work here is requires a scoping document so that we know before it comes in the fall that we're sort of comfortable with the scope of what's being proposed and studied. The scoping document will be transmitted, I understand, tomorrow. So we don't have it here today, but we do have the sort of task areas and timeline, general timeline in front of you. The plan is next month to have a workshop format. Instead of meeting here on the dais, we'll meet somewhere else in a more of a conference room setting where we can have more engaged discussion. And we will be delving into the scoping at that time, taking it up again probably in June for making sure that we have all our feedback to Metro before they put together their draft framework, which will come to us in the fall.